Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A huge welcome to Blocks Up. My name is Pernilla Berg. I'm Science Director here at Blocks Up, and this is another Science Talks, taking a deep dive into the regenerative. We are looking at how we implement the regenerative development. And in order to do so, I have allied myself with Professor Joanna Williams from UCL Bartlett, Director of Circular City Hub. And it is such a huge honor and pleasure to welcome Joanna with us today, because during our series of the regenerative, we have asked this question because we think there is a need, given the manifold crises that we're facing worldwide, that we have to ask which paradigm can guide us safely into the future with respect to the planetary boundaries and also with respect to the world which we wish to live in. And adding the regenerative paradigm to that discussion is also trying to answer the question, how do we not just do less harm, but how do we do good in the world? And during the last few science talks, we've really taken a deep dive into what is the regenerative. What does it mean to have regenerative architecture? And at the end of it all, we always end up saying the how to. How do we ensure this will actually happen? So I reached out to Joanna, who has conducted quite an amazing amount of research, developed educational programs to ensure this sustainable transformation, and also seen how it's done throughout various cities. And luckily enough, Joanna said, yes, I will come and share my knowledge, my experiences, and my learnings. So I'm really, really thankful for that. Thank you, Joanna. And for those of you who have not been with us before during our science talks, BlocksUps was established in 2018 with that specific mission of creating a sustainable urban future together. We also have a stark awareness that we cannot do this alone. Consilience is needing, meaning that we advocate, cherish, that we are collaborating together with practice, academia, experts alike, in partnerships, in addressing cross-disciplinarily in the ways how we have to ensure this urban transition. In our science talks, we try to take the deep dives in sharing, not just the research knowledge, but also the experiences from research put into practice. I have with me a colleague that will take you safely through the chat, so you're more than welcome to ask questions and comments while we're live. And Joanna, thank you so very much. I've actually been looking at your resume and I could go on for many minutes, but I'll let you maybe just give a few key words to your vast experience. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll let you present your take on this regenerative transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful introduction. Yep, I've worked for a number of years looking at sustainable cities more broadly, and looking more specifically at zero carbon, resource efficient, and regenerative nature-based solution type solutions in cities as well. I'm looking across the board at this for a number of years now. But today I want to focus on the regenerative, and I want to talk a little bit to start with about the why, although I don't intend to sort of dwell on that for too long. I think you all know why, that's why you're here. But I think it is quite useful to put in context in terms of the sort of the paradigm that I'm talking to you about today, sort of some of the key, I suppose, goals of why we might want to take these initiatives in the future. So I suppose the two biggest problems facing humanity, certainly in ecological terms, and possibly in total, are the climate crisis and also the resource crisis. And as you are all aware, I'm sure by 2050, over 75% of the population will be living in cities. 75% of the world's natural resources will be consumed by cities, and 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions will also be coming from cities. So cities are a really good place to start if we're going to try and reduce their impact on the wider global environment. But also from the city's perspective, it's also really important to start addressing issues around both resource security and the health of the urban ecosystem, which obviously impacts on us as we live in those ecosystems. So we produce a lot of waste, a lot of rubbish, and this, as you can see here, picture of a lot of rubbish, and behind we also have sort of infrastructure, which also can remain empty and create rubbish, if you like, wasted infrastructure. We also have a lot of contaminated sites in urban areas, which again don't necessarily get built on as a result of both contamination but also speculation in some cities. We need to think about that sort of idea of waste in this sort of much broader sense, waste of any sort of resource in ecological terms. And I think also we need to think about things like sewerage. Sewerage can be an enormous resource in actual fact if we deal with it well. And we also will be thinking about lots of other things like greywater recycling and so on. So I think one of the first things to say is in addition to the fact that we need resource security in cities, and we're also trying to sort of address this problem of waste and what we do with it and where it goes if we don't do anything with it, we also need to start thinking about our relationship with sort of wider environment. So here's a picture of London. London consumes 125 times its size in terms of its global footprint, pretty huge. And this is to both produce the resources that it needs, but also to assimilate the waste that it produces. And London is but one city. It's over 8 million people, but at the same time, it's far smaller. And certainly if we're talking in the sort of Asian context, it's far smaller than a lot of cities. One of the big problems with cities is that we have a largely parasitic relationship with our hinterlands. So we consume the resources produced in the hinterlands, but we also consume the ecosystem services which are provided by those hinterlands. And in actual fact, many of our cities have moved further and further towards not producing any resources, and also, having less and less in the way of ecosystem services in order to sustain themselves over the long term. This is compounded by the fact that most urban ecosystems are in a state of degradation. And as they are degraded, this impacts on the sort of biological cycles, the hydrological cycles and so on within cities, which impacts on nutrients and water and minerals and things like photosynthesis and transpiration. Things which help us to sequester carbon or produce oxygen or cool our cities and so on. So, it has a major impact in terms of we're looking at those types of cycles. This also reduces the ecosystem's capacity, the urban ecosystem's capacity to actually provide and produce resources locally, if indeed those systems aren't working effectively. So the degradation of the urban ecosystem not only affects human health, which is something we quite often discuss, which is extremely important, but it also reduces the potential for cities to produce resources, become more sufficient, and also adapt to things like climate change. So that's the problem, I suppose. And in this talk, I want to just talk briefly about what I mean by regenerative development. And regenerative development is a very holistic approach to creating positive outcomes between sort of culture, the built environment, and the natural environment in the urban ecosystem. And the idea here really is for us to move to the full potential of that ecosystem. And that will mean drawing on the local assets, what's there already, essentially. It will mean enabling those local assets to actually regenerate in that process, to be restored. It will also mean that we need to think more about this dualism between humans and the nature. So we need to reduce our sort of cultural focus, really, which has always been on this kind of dualism between the two things. We need to think of ourselves as being part of that system, and not separate from that system. So, this is a diagram again, which probably a lot of you have seen already, and it's just this sort of really showing you where the regenerative end of the spectrum lies, if you like. So on the sort of far left, you can see this is sort of conventional development, and then we're moving to things which improve efficiencies, for example, and that's sort of classified as green development. Sustainable development here is almost being talked about in terms of sustaining the status quo, which in my opinion is not entirely fair. But nevertheless, it certainly isn't necessarily talking about moving to the next level of potential for the ecosystem itself. And of course, with sustainable development, there are a lot of interplays with other requirements for economic and sort of social sustainability within that. So it is a different kind of, it's a different sort of approach. Whereas regenerative development really does recognise it's very much more based in the urban ecological context, I think, and it's really looking at how we look at the context. So the context is extremely important. Realising the full potential depends on what local resources there are available and what the ecological assets are already within your urban ecosystem, for example. I've already mentioned it slightly, but this relationship between the city and its hinterland is also extremely important. So these more complex relationships, so looking beyond the boundaries of the city and beyond the boundaries probably even of the nation state in some instances with some of these types of relationships. But it's about moving beyond this very parasitic relationship to a much more symbiotic one, where essentially the city acts in its own interests rather than just sort of sucking the resources, if you like, from the hinterland. And the other sort of fourth very important dimension of this is the engagement of us, the community, in that process. And the importance really of that is that we need to become responsible for these changes. We need to be part of that process. So we become, so you probably heard a lot co-design and so on, but it's about co-provision. We're becoming sort of producers within our own environment, much more engaged in that process and more responsible for it. And the idea here really is we're building capacity within the ecosystem, and that's us, and that's the ecological assets, and that's everything surrounding that, including local resources and so on, to enable the full potential to be reached. So in real terms, what does it mean? It means, one, looking at resource regeneration, and creating the circular resource flows. The second thing is it's about really regenerating natural capital, and particularly ecosystems and ecosystem services. Then probably a lot more, what most of us think of in terms of regeneration is the kind of the regeneration of the built environment, if you like, the built spaces. And then this kind of community regeneration, because we also, if we're going to engage people in these processes, we need to give them the capacity to do that. And that might be through things like skills and training. It might be giving them time to do it. It might be giving them the financial resources to actually engage in these processes. But it does mean that we need to build capacity. So it's all about building capacity. And then another thing to say is that regenerative design happens across a range of scales, unsurprisingly. And when we're thinking about cities, it's sort of equally important to think at this sort of bioregional level, certainly in terms of resource flows. And then sort of track back, if you like, to thinking much more at the neighbourhood scale in terms of changing people's behaviours and so on. For example, this is extremely effective to look at these in different ways. But we do have to think that this is a very much, and again, this is something that comes through very strongly in the regenerative paradigm, is that it's complex and it's a multi-scalar process, and we need to think at lots of different levels. So on the one hand, we need green spaces, pocket parks or whatever, that people can actually use that are locally accessible, which they can engage with, things like sort of small urban farming projects in the city and so on. But equally well, we also need things like green corridors, which enable kind of dispersal of biodiversity, but equally encourage things like active transport and so on within cities. So we need to think about it from a very much more of a multi-scalar perspective. I think the other thing to say here is that generally we don't. And generally, we don't think, for example, in terms of bioregions. Really, the only resource we think of in terms of bioregions is probably water. But again, there's, we've been doing some research which is looking at the different scales, for example, at which certain types of resources should be circulating, and lower value resources at the moment, because of the sort of economic parameters, tend to circulate unsurprisingly at more local level. So if they've got low value, if they're things like organic waste, for example, they're more likely to circulate at a much more localized within a localized area. Whereas if you have sort of critical materials, for example, which have got very high value on the markets, then that's likely to be much more of an international loop that you're doing. So it would be way beyond your city boundary that will then be recirculating. But what we do need to do is that's very much thinking about things in economic terms, and we tend to either be governed by our administrative boundaries, or the economy, the markets, if you like, at the moment, in terms of these different types of resource loops and ecosystem service provisions. And again, this is something we need to think about in terms of how we cope with that and design for that in the future. So I just wanted to briefly, well, hopefully, sort of give you a few examples of where I think, this ecological design has been put into practice. So I think regenerative sort of development, we could argue, can be seen in a number of different European cities. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. So this is the first example. This is De Kervel. It's in Amsterdam. It's in the sort of port area of Amsterdam. It was a highly contaminated site. It was in an area which was undergoing the process of kind of usual urban regeneration process. The local authority here was trying to encourage and is trying to encourage various forms of circular development. This project was put forward by a sort of series of local actors, community actors, who did have expertise, sort of architectural expertise. There were sort of planners involved in this process, and various other sort of businesses that engaged in this process, but all were very interested in the idea of creating a regenerative form of development. So it was very much a grassroots approach. This site was given to the group for a temporary period, so it's got a temporary planning permission. And it was basically, the idea really was to set up a living lab, which could be learnt from by the people that were actually involved in this process, but also by everyone who visited it, essentially. So why was it so interesting? Well, one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting is because they use phytoremediation. So they use plants essentially on site to decontaminate the soil on site. Now, obviously, this is an ongoing process. It's not finished and it takes time to do it. So the other thing that they did on site was they made sure that the infrastructure, the service infrastructure, wasn't underground, so that there wasn't a problem with either putting it in the ground or contamination once you actually are on site itself. So again, they did this through using various types of autonomous systems. So they've got an autonomous renewable energy generating system. They use solar power, but they also use heat exchangers in the buildings, and they use peer-to-peer blockchain as a sort of an energy trading system locally. So that's how that functions. They've also got an autonomous water purification system. So here they use various things. They've got struvite reactors in the urinals, which take the potassium basically from the urinals, and this can then be used as a sort of as compost. They've got heliophytic filters as well, which is great for grey water recycling. They've got various different types of rainwater collection as well on site. And in addition, they've used recycled boats to create the offices and cafe and studios, which are actually on site as well, all of which reduces embodied carbon. So here we can see an example of a project where you've got reuse of infrastructure. You've got obviously looping of resources at all stages, particularly at sort of water, energy, and you could argue really the land, the soil, and so on. You've got the ecological regeneration essentially of the site, particularly the soil on site, and community engagement in that project. Okay. So the next example I just wanted to briefly talk about, again, another, I think, example of regenerative development is Stockholm Royal Seaport, which we can see here. Again, this uses lots of different strategies rather than, I think, technologies. It's much more about strategies to sort of try and reduce the impact at lots of different levels, really, at lots of different scales of the activities that go on in this place. So, for example, the organic waste from the ships is collected from the ships, and it's used to make compost and also create biogas. But this also reduces the damage that it would have done had it gone straight into the harbour, so it reduces the impact on the aquatic environment. You've got a grey water reuse system, which reduces the flash flooding, because in Stockholm they have quite a problem, in fact, with flash flooding. But in the summer as well, the grey water is also used to water, obviously, the area within the seaport itself. But it's also used because it's right next to it's the only city with a national park, I think. So it also within that area, it's used to water stuff within the national park. They use garden and park waste to create more compost and biofuel, which is then used in the closed loop system, which operates more broadly within the city itself. And another interesting one is they've used bioremediation in caverns under the site, which were previously used to store naphtha. And they've basically used archaea microbes to restore those caves. And you can see here, hopefully, in the background, you can also see there's a lot of tree planting, green roofs, and green courtyards, which are integrated throughout the site. And you have blue corridors as well, all of which help with things like carbon sequestration and pollution and flooding, etc. This project had very limited involvement at the early stage, and this is one of the problems with implementation, I think. This because basically the people who were going to be living here weren't on site when this happened. So with these sort of new projects, this can be an issue if people aren't then engaged in that design process. They're now trying to retrofit this and engage people more through lots of different things like urban agriculture on site, for example, through the generation of their own renewable energy. And also throughout the process through the operation of this sort of closed loop energy recovery system that they use in Stockholm. This is my hometown. So this is London, and this is the Olympic site in London, which some of you may have come across, which is now the biggest urban park, I think, in Europe. And this site was in a terrible state. It had very high levels of contamination, and the waterways were, in a poor state. And as a result of the Olympics, this site was basically regenerated in all senses of the word. So there were more blue and green infrastructure was brought onto the site as a result of a huge soil kind of washing activities that went on site over quite a prolonged period of time. There was also contamination. There was a lot of contamination in terms of the rivers and groundwater as well. And again, microbes, archaea, were used for decontaminating that groundwater. But also there have been conservation projects on the site to improve the waterways. There's been a lot of management sort of put in place essentially to improve the site. They put in place a black water recycling system on site, which has been incredibly important from the point of view that this site suffered from both overflow from the sewerage system during sort of periods of flooding, which was frequent. So it's reduced the amount of sewerage in the system and therefore reduced the impact of those sort of flash floods, if you like. But also it's enabled more grey water to become available. So sort of processing of black water to grey water, more grey water to be available on site to be reused again across the park. So certainly from a looping and ecological regeneration, and they also reused a lot of the existing infrastructure. Even the Olympic infrastructure was either reused on site or off site after the Olympics. This has been very successful. But again, the degree of sort of community engagement from the start was probably not enough. And there's been a lot of community engagement, particularly in things like conservation projects and so on since then. But again, this is something that definitely weaker on. Paris. So Paris has been quite historically a city where there has been a lot of market gardening and so on. But certainly by the start of this century, there was very little green space in Paris. And the government want to really become much more self-sufficient in terms of food cycles. And the idea here was to create a kind of a regional food loop, which would be established through doing things like food reuse, but also by growing food in the lands surrounding Paris, as well as we can see here, reusing space on top of buildings and so on, and within Paris itself, growing food through this kind of new initiative, the Pariculture initiative. And so, the idea here was that Paris would become more self-sufficient in terms of its food by both looping, but also through ecological regeneration, and then enabling sort of urban agriculture to take place on site. And I think the idea as well was really to engage a whole series of businesses as well as the public in this. And certainly there's been a very inclusive process in Paris in terms of engaging the public in the creation of their circular strategies and many of their strategies. And there is certainly a hope that the public will get more involved in this process. The only problem is that a lot of this space is still extremely expensive, and it generally tends to mean that it's sort of greater emphasis placed on sort of commercial businesses to deliver a lot of these services. Okay. And here again, we've got Amsterdam. Amsterdam is also adopting a more regional approach to looking at its resources. And this is the organic, the sort of waste system for Amsterdam. It's really interesting from the point of view that, they're taking this much more strategic city regional approach. They're using wastewater for lots of different things within this. So using sewage to produce proteins for food stock, for instance. And potentially in the future for food, maybe. They're also using it to produce things like building materials, using lignin and cellulose. They're also using it to produce chemicals. So you've got sort of a growing biochemical. You already had a biochemical industry in Amsterdam, but this is augmenting it. And of course, it's being used as well to produce things like biogas. So this is again this sort of circular loop. And why is it ecological? Well, it's ecological, I suppose, because we're reusing the wastes that are generated in various different ways. But it's also from the point of view that we are they also got the potential to reduce the amount of land outside of Amsterdam, if you like, for things like food production, if you can actually sort of recycle some of those proteins. Okay, so. And finally, the last example, I've given you a lot of examples, but hopefully you're starting to see some of the problems that are arising as well through this. This is another example from London. It's Brixton. And in some ways, I think it might provide one of the best examples of regenerative development because it brings together all aspects. It's got a very strong community element to it. The sort of Brixton case was set up. So Transitions Town Brixton was set up back in 2010, and it was set up to address climate change. And it was a grassroots initiative. It's a sort of social enterprise, which engaged the community, and then sort of had lots of spin-offs, if you like, from that. Like there was a community energy company that was set up. There were various community urban farming schemes. There's a community orchard now. Lots of different schemes like this. There were also other community schemes like food reuse schemes in Brixton, for example, the Brixton fridge, which is where local people can put any food that they have left over for other people. And there's lots, and there are bigger sort of initiatives, and that's very sort of much smaller initiative. But they use a lot of the spaces that were provided were essentially on a lot of contaminated sites, or it was in existing infrastructure. So they have a kind of repair cafe, which is called the Remakery, which was in an old car park. They have a thing called Pot Brixton, which is actually now much more sort of leisure space, commercial space, retail space, I suppose. But that was also an old car park. But that's also brought in lots of other things. It's got food reuse schemes, it's got urban farming on site, and all of these different activities have been enabled by having temporary spaces given over in this kind of district in London. It's a bit large in the district, but this area in London, to these different types of uses. And it was driven essentially by the community. It's being driven by the community. And the other interesting thing is that they've also got a local currency, which helped in this process, certainly initially, because it basically meant that people were more likely to buy things that were grown locally, that were sort of through the things like the Remakery. This local currency was used as through sort of Pot Brixton. They've had food reuse cafes. Again, you could pay in Brixton pounds for this. And also the local authority paid their staff part of their wages in Brixton pounds, which meant there was more of this currency in operation. And what else? Also, we have a kind of renewable energy, which was provided on the roofs of sort of social housing, which was part of this community energy company. And again, you know, they were paid in Brixton pounds. So, and this created this sort of local circulation of resources. It also helped to finance some of these activities that were on these temporary sites, essentially, and it grew organically. And there are spin-off projects that keep coming from that. So all very interesting. So the idea here really is to, when we're thinking about regenerative development, I think we bring together all of these different actions that I've got on here. But I think the core of it is really thinking about ecological regeneration, creating adaptive environments and looping those resources. Now, the extent to which we can do this locally, for example, is very helpful if we want to increase the ecological sustainability and the social sustainability of those sorts of activities. But I think it's also very important to think about, and I hope you can read this, but if you can't, it's in I've got a book out which you should have a look at, and I think there are journal papers with this in as well, which you might be able to access more easily online. But basically what this shows you is that it's very important for us to think of these things in context and think about the interlinkages between these different types of actions, so that we get these very strong synergies between ecological regeneration and resource looping and adaptation, for example. And then we start to get much bigger conflicts between sort of other types of strategies. So, for example, when we're looking at substitution and efficiency, we start to optimization, as is called here. But if we think about substitution and optimization, we quite often more likely to get conflicts. So if I just unpick that slightly, for instance, if you've got resource looping actions, you can help to regenerate urban ecosystems. I think that's sort of been demonstrated already to an extent. So recycling soil, organic waste, grey and wastewater removes the pollutants and regenerates the urban ecosystem. So, for example, in Stockholm, the rainwater storage and grey water recycling reduced localised flooding and the dispersal of pollutants into the harbour, which helped to restore the marine environment. So you can see that there is a kind of a loop being created there. Recycling of residual nutrients to provide food proteins in Amsterdam reduced the land needed to grow food in the Amsterdam metropolitan region and the emissions from transporting that food, which can help to restore the ecosystem, of course. And here the potential impact on the core hinterland seems obvious, this relationship. There's also very strong relationships, as I've already kind of mentioned, between localization and resource looping. Again, as demonstrated in Amsterdam, localization increases the economic feasibility of reusing, recycling, and energy recovery from organic and construction waste, which reduces emissions from associated transportation and helps to also build the local economy. But there are conflicts, as sort of hinted at already. For example, localization might limit the opportunities for resource looping if you don't have enough, if there's limited numbers of producers and consumers of those wasted resources within your locality. And this is why Amsterdam and Paris both have a much more sort of regional approach to dealing with both construction and organic waste. And also, I mentioned optimization and substitution as well. If you're thinking about moving towards looping actions, they can come into contact or conflict with both optimization and substitution. So in Stockholm, they found it very difficult to move away from energy recovery because all of the systems are in place, essentially, the infrastructural systems, but also the institutional ones are in place for energy recovery. It's been very hard to move towards the use of things like solar energy and also to move up the hierarchy towards more waste recycling and reuse as a result of that. So we need to think about this wider context. We need to think about the other strategies that are being brought to bear in your city. Are you already adopting an optimization strategy or a substitution strategy, which might conflict, for example, with your looping strategies? So we do need to think about that in the much wider context. There's lots of different policy levers. This again, it's in my book, but it's basically the different policy levers that are used in European cities to try and implement this more regenerative form of development. And the key one really is planning. And I've sort of mentioned it in some ways with my examples, which is, planning can bring together a strategic vision really that brings together all of these elements, the resource looping, the ecological regeneration and adaptive strategies. It can bring it all together and show us territorially how it will play out. It also can obviously provide land. It can identify areas with land which, using strong sort of contractual agreements, you can encourage this more regenerative form of development. Temporary permissions, as was the case in both De Kervel's case and Brixton, have been incredibly helpful in enabling some of these sort of regenerative forms of development. They're often low value forms of development, and they have to compete with other types of development in cities, and these temporary permissions enable that to happen. And also, again, really with both those two examples, the much more collaborative process where the people who are going to be living and working in those areas are actually engaged in the process, also has helped them to understand what's available, how it works, how it best operates, and to really grow their capacity to understand this. And some of these people have taken it elsewhere and applied it in different places. So again, that helps them to achieve their potential, I suppose, as well. I think another powerful tool is public procurement, particularly if we're thinking about things like resource looping. If we can sort of through public procurement, for example, in Amsterdam, they use that to encourage the recycling of things like bricks locally, so things sort of reused locally. You can use sort of public procurement to buy locally produced or recycled food, or locally produced locally produced energy from waste. So there's lots of different ways that we can use that sort of thing. I mentioned local currency, that could help. That could certainly help to create, again, sort of closed resource loops. But any sort of low value scheme, if you make it so that there is a way of ensuring that the sort of financial input into that scheme is more localized, that can also be helpful. Experimental labs are also helpful for testing out different types of regenerative design and so on, but also engaging people in this co-design process and provisioning process. And finally, something that I think is extremely important and is sort of underplayed at the moment is data, and data for monitoring the impact of these schemes. So in many cases with the regenerative schemes, people don't have the time and wherewithal and resources to monitor how successful their projects are. And it's very difficult for them to then demonstrate the value of those projects, which then means it's very difficult often for them to remain competitive in the long term, and they get out competed. So it's very important actually to monitor this. It's also important for local authorities to be able to monitor their policies and help that they give in this process, and to demonstrate the benefits to the local community and the wider community of adopting those approaches. And also creating data platforms. So for example, with the idea with the Pariculture initiative, in order to basically do things like crowdsource funding for new urban agricultural projects, which would enable greater community engagement in those projects, but also identifying sites where this can happen. For example, I mean, there's lots of different ways of using data and data platforms to make this more effective. Okay, there are also huge numbers of challenges, unfortunately, to sort of this type of development. And it will vary very much with context. So the size of your population, the type of economic activities that are happening within your cities, the climate, the existing degree of environmental degradation, the cultural attitudes towards environment, public willingness to engage in things like co-provision and local regulations. All of these things are going to make a difference in terms of the types of challenges you can expect to face. But really, I think the key challenges to regenerative development are about the low value which is actually placed on the resources and the ecosystem services in the first place. You know, the value that's actually placed on the environment, I suppose. You know, this is a very old argument, and you know, for all the sort of ecological economists out there, sorry for going over old ground, but it's very important. And basically, this is compounded, I think, by the fact that we've got this lack of data that I've already mentioned. This kind of reduces political interest and also the willingness of investors to invest in these more regenerative activities. And it makes it difficult for these activities to actually compete for space in urban environments. So if we can deal with this, maybe, you know, that will help in terms of implementation. The second thing is time scale. So for regenerative development, you're going to need longer time frames for sort of the ecological regeneration processes to show the rewards, if you like. And there's difficulties with this because you have shorter political sort of time frames in terms of how often people were elected, and also short investment time frames. So, you know, it's a question of, in the wider context, how do we get around the fact that you've got these short timeframes in terms of this, and yet the actual process is much longer. I think as well, one of the things that I've come across is that there's also quite a heavy reliance in terms of grassroots activities in this kind of more regenerative process. It's a socio-ecological model, right? So, you know, generally speaking, it's not necessarily economically as robust, or it can be not as robust. And so there's this heavy reliance on grassroots activities, temporary spaces, temporary funding. It's run by volunteers quite often. And this means these activities find it difficult to sustain in the long term or to scale up. So again, there is a question around how can cities, for example, support these activities if they're grassroots. And then finally, the other thing that I think is a big problem is the scale and the cross-boundary coordination of this. So we need to think about managing resources and ecosystem services at appropriate scales, as I sort of mentioned earlier in this presentation. And this often requires cooperation across those administrative boundaries, so beyond the city limits, basically. And this can often create problems, not only because the different administrations have different resources and competencies with which that they can implement this, but also because there are issues around who's benefiting by adopting this approach. And if it's purely these people living in the city and not the people living in the hinterland that are benefiting from this, then it's going to be something very difficult to sell for the local politicians in the hinterland, if you like. So you've definitely got to start to understand what the benefits are and the disbenefits are and where they are spatially located, if you like, in order to sort of build a case, if you like, for a more regenerative approach, I think. So yes, you know, all of these different ideas, I talk about this in terms of a thing I call circular development, which turns out to actually be regenerative development because it brings together this idea of resource looping and adaptive communities and infrastructure and ecological regeneration. And as I've said, it's the symbiosis between these actions which are extremely important and what we have to try and encourage because it gives us more than the sum of its parts. Anyway, I've written about this. I've written about the problems of implementation, particularly in European cities, in my book. But also, if you have a look at our website, there's lots of other open source, I think, journal papers and publications that you may find of interest. And my particular focus is on implementation. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Joanna. I'm basically speechless. I think this has been really, 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 really nice because it's a topic that is receiving more and more attention, as you know. And throughout quite the last, certainly this year, I keep meeting people asking the how-tos. And here you come and you're just really outlining the opportunities, the benefits, but also when we talk about systemic approach, I think what you have really elucidated through the various examples are just how pervasive this systemic approach, what it can actually bring about. Thank you, really, absolutely amazing. Before I start asking all my questions, I'll just look at my colleague. Do we have questions or comments from our, not yet? So those of you who are participating virtually, if you have questions and comments, just please write them now because I know there is a little bit of a loop. So for me to get your questions and comments, please start typing if you have any. So those of you with me, if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. I just thought I'd like to explore a little bit. You've mentioned the strong synergies, and we'll get to those. But you also talk about the connection and the connectivity between cities and the hinterland. And one of the things I thought was quite interesting was when you document both the benefits and disbenefits. And of course, that this can also be one of the challenges if people can't see the benefits of what a regenerative development can do to the hinterland. So, allow me, it's a long introduction to my question. But we have a Danish researcher who's advocated that cities are good because we can stay in the cities and then basically the rest of planet Earth can be left to itself. And what you were mentioning early on in your presentation was an overconsumption in the city if we compared the ratio. And could I ask you to expand a little bit on that? You had London as a case in point, if I remember my notes correctly. And just thought that was really, really interesting to maybe elaborate a little bit if I could persuade you to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is not a new idea. This is something I think that Mumford and Patrick Geddes and various other people talked about sort of at the start of the last century. So it's something people have been concerned about for a long time. Um, and certainly the answer to achieving our global environmental goals are not just I don't think, focus in cities. I mean, cities can make a huge contribution, but the linkage with the hinterland is extremely important. Um, and I think one of the questions as well is that is about the size of cities and the constant expansion of cities and the extent to which, if we want to create more sufficient systems, if you like, how big we can go before it's impossible, essentially, to create those more sufficient systems. And when I talk about sufficiency, I don't mean completely sufficient. Obviously, the larger the development you've got, the less likely it is it's going to be sufficient. But there is a very strong relationship between the two, and I think the other thing is that we're thinking about it in terms of London at the moment, and if you want to sort of, for example, provide a lot of the ecosystem services and you want to grow your population's food in the area surrounding London, and you want to potentially generate energy there, and you want to sort of recover energy from the bio waste and all the rest of it, what are you losing essentially in the area? And then there's conflict between that and the provision of affordable housing, for example, for the local communities outside of London. And it does overall mean a complete rethink about the way we use the hinterland, and the fact that we could provide an array of different types of economic activities in the hinterland, which would potentially substitute for some of the movement into the city in the first place, which would drive greater economic activity and so on. But it does have to then be weighed up against demand for other things. And we're certainly starting to see that there's a conflict between the two, and there isn't one solution, and it's something that will have to be that comes back to the sort of contextual relevance, which is very important in a regenerative design approach. It is that you need to bring your population with you, and there are definitely economic advantages, if you like, to the hinterland of providing these services. And I suppose it's about whether you can sort of explain this, or but also it's also about whether or not you need to then think about, when you're designing your cities, well, to what extent are we going to rely on the hinterland, and to what extent are we actually going to provide some of those ourselves within the cities, which is really the reason for providing things like green corridors and taking these other sorts of approaches within the city. Is you're not going to it's not going to become completely symbiotic, but it's all a gray area. It's about moving more in that direction, I suppose. That's what seems to be happening in practice, at least.
And I think it's really interesting because it's one of the things that also struck me during your presentation was your constant emphasis on capacity building. That this will not happen on its own, and it also requires a lot of capacity building along the way. And I was thinking, when you started talking about public procurement, and also the disadvantages of the regenerative loops, in terms that it's actually not that easy to then change if you have a closed loop of energy systems. So that level of capacity building is not just within awareness and interest and local synergies, but it's actually also quite technical capacity building, I would surmise, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also there's an issue around what planning's role is in that, and the capacity of planners to actually envisage what the future infrastructure might look like, for example, because they're going to be the ones a lot of the time making those sorts of decisions.
Yep.
Sorry.
No, it's just really fascinating because it's also the ones that will make sure what you said, the temporary commissions and the experimentation. So they need to have some, I would assume, a sense of what is it that they would like to see experimented on in order to obtain data for future decision making processes.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah. I think I have. Is it, if I understood the signals correctly? We have a question. We have two. So I'm just going to pass the microphone on to my colleague.
There is a question from Pedro. What would you say is the biggest barrier of scaling such regenerative practices and doing it fast?
It's economics, honestly. I think it as I said before, it's the low value of these activities currently. It's the fact that we don't really value ecosystem services. I mean, there's a lot of attempts now to look at how we might sort of estimate, for example, the ecosystem services you get from trees, and given the sort of coverage, how much water gets essentially contained and how much carbon sequestration and all that kind of thing. But it needs to be done. It needs to be done a lot more effectively if you're going to make some sort of financial arguments. But we also need to value those services. So I think, and in a sort of very practical term, one of the biggest problems, so, and this is looking at more globally, I mean, I did quite a lot of work. We were looking at green infrastructure in China. One of the biggest barriers, as it was in the UK, by the way, as well, one of the biggest barriers to sort of having green infrastructure was the problem of managing and maintaining it, and the problem of financing it. And there is now this kind of push towards, because there's less and less money that's being given to sort of local authorities, cities, and so on to actually do this. And you've got more private sector companies that are sort of providing these types of services, but there isn't the funding for it. And that now they're looking at sort of alternative models which are much more community based, which is great from the point of view of engaging communities and maybe changing their behavior and their practices, and also their sort of their love, if you like, of the natural world. But on the other side, it doesn't necessarily sort of create strategic greenways and things like this within the city long term. So, I think one of the biggest barriers really is the low prioritization, low political prioritization, the low value that's actually placed on the services and resources that are created by this.
Thank you. The next question is how can the private sector contribute to the creation of regional value chain or even regional business model?
Ooh, difficult one. Good question. How can it? I suppose. So, I think that the private sector can probably only do so much. So I'm thinking about things like circular construction in the UK, which was something that's been heavily pushed at a regional, sort of city regional level in London. But and it's certainly been something that the construction industry has adopted in London. But the problem is that you are producing a lot of, in London it works because you produce a lot of resource and there's a lot of demand for that resource. But it doesn't really go beyond those boundaries. And the question then is, how do you, I don't know, how do you stimulate demand at that kind of scale? And the only way you can really do it is through a sort of a national regulatory framework, which is, something which is being looked at in the Netherlands, for example, to encourage those sort of processes. So in some ways, and the Netherlands, Amsterdam is a really good example because you've got the sort of circular construction system which is being put in place in Amsterdam, and the intention there at national level is for it to scale up. So the kind of the networks, the business networks that are being put in place, and the capacity is being built within the construction industry, within the supply chains, and so on within the construction industry. Within Amsterdam, the learning is happening at a much wider level because those actors are working at a national scale. They're not just working in Amsterdam, but it's also being supported and funded by government, and is going to be sort of part of the regulatory environment as well. And I think it's those things in combination which can help. And if you're a business essentially trying to do the same thing, I think it's obviously it depends, I guess, what sector you're working in, but certainly it's going to be much more difficult, and it will require sort of partnerships to be made. So for example, if you're looking at things like wastewater, there are going to be a lot of actors that would need to come together in order to sort of benefit from that, which would probably need to link in with things like the biochem industry and construction industries and so on. So I guess it's about it's I think there's definitely a lot of regional value that can be had in terms of these lower value resources, and the circulation of lower value resources. But you would need support in the creation of the networks, the supply networks, and adequate demand in order to make that happen. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
I think it answered it really, really well, and also very, very interesting in terms of future development and political discussions that surely have to be made, and also tapping into to your earlier point in terms of capacity building, because developing partnerships across industries and sectors, as you correctly identify, the need of doing also requires a lot of capacity building in terms of cultural understanding, development of a shared frame of languages. So I think this is really, really interesting. And I think you're also touching upon one of the, probably at a comprehension level, not as much as a lived level for every person in the city, but we have spent a few decades, and we have generations grown up within the global economy. And some of the things that you're actually addressing is a transition in which the global economy will still be global, but it'll be looped kind of as a spiral within kind of smaller scale localities, if you like, of economies and regional and whatnot. And I think that is also a change in how we have to perceive ourselves in the system, would just be my venturing. But I think it's really interesting what you're pointing to. And I think, as you're also saying, there are actually some concrete examples. One of the things I know we're running out of time, but I was thinking about all of your very, very beautiful grassroots examples, that once a regional development or an urban planner or a local community embraces the grassroots activities, that also increases the difficulties of data monitoring, because a grassroots initiative may not, from the onset, know what it is that they have to collect data on. So as you were kind of pointing out, the need to document the impact or the value or the learnings acquired along the way, the bottom-up organic grassroots initiatives may actually not have that as their point of departure when they're setting about the various initiatives and experiments. So I think you're really pointing to some of these interesting maybe realms emerging or certainly meeting each other in the very near future, if not already taking place. Just my one brief reflection on your amazing presentation. I don't know if you agree or want to comment on it.
I think you're very right. I think I mean this, and going back to the previous question, I suppose one of the, I think the role of cities should definitely encompass this. So I think it's one of the things that cities can do very well. They, because if they want to adopt this, if they want to encourage a more organic approach, they're going to have to support these sort of smaller entities in order to make that happen. And one of the ways they can do that is by doing the monitoring, because those entities aren't going to do it. They're doing it in practice, so support them to do that in practice. And I suppose if you take this more organic approach, I personally, again, I think you need both. I think you need, because if, the previous questioner asked about how do you make it happen fast. You can't just rely on the sort of this more organic approach to make it happen fast. So there are sort of more top-down initiatives. And if we want to create, I don't know, big green corridors in cities and so on, that's a much more strategic thing to do. If you want to create sort of proper closed loop sectoral resource flows as well, that's something that has to be done at a much more strategic level, and it needs to be invested in. And that, I think, can be driven by regulation, by procurement, by sort of public financing. It can be done in different ways depending on what country you're working in and what your political proclivities are, if you like. But I do think, on the other hand, that you're absolutely right that, I think the organic approach sits very well with the regenerative approach, because it's building the capacity within the community. So we're changing everything. We're changing us as well as our environment, if you like, in a much more positive fashion.
I think that is the most beautiful way to thank you for such an inspirational presentation, and also a deep dive into your extensive research. So thank you very, very much, Joanna. I think we'll wish you just a wonderful afternoon and go on our merry way on that positive note, that we will grow and develop as we acquire the experiences in transforming our world and our daily lives into a more regenerative fashion. Thank you very, 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 very much. And thank you for everyone participating today. I hope to see you here again the next time, as we are embarking on the journey of designing the regenerative society. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you everyone for today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.